All right, I'm now joined by my good friend Bhaskar Sunkara, who is here to continue the Sunday debate breakdown series with me by watching Christopher Hitchens and John Judis's 1986 debate against a couple of objectivists of Ayn Rand Institute people. Bhaskar, I should say, everybody knows he's the main editor of Jacobin, also relevantly to this. We have something in common, which is that like me, he's a leftist with a massive soft spot, despite everything in the last 10 years for Christopher Hitchens.
A pre 2003 Christopher Hitchens, or maybe 2001. But it would have been interesting to see how his politics evolved. Maybe there would have been a few triggers that caused him to, embrace decency again in the last few years. But I'm not holding out much hope.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's not out of the question that he could have supported Bernie in the 2016 primary, certainly given his hatred of the Clintons and of Henry Kissinger, who came up in that primary. But then again, it's also very easy to imagine him as a Corbyn hater. In fact, that seems likely. And I tend to think like the worst version of Hitchens that I can easily imagine in the last couple of years would have been just one who was just like the most annoying kind of resistance lib in the Trump era.
Oh yeah. I think he would have probably followed like the Bill Kristol kind of direction. And yeah, maybe I could see him like he definitely had a soft spot to the end for Irish republicanism. That was probably the one thing they had in Corbyn that was actually true. He was soft on Irish republicanism as opposed to all the other things they tried to do, like linking him with Hezbollah and the rest. But yeah.
Yeah.
So I just realized I'm connected to a very bad Wi-Fi that's in another room, so I'm going to switch Wi-Fi to the one right next to me. If you lose me, it'll only be for like 10 seconds.
Okay, no problem. All right. So while Bhaskar's Wi-Fi is switching over, let me just really quickly plug a couple of things that are coming up. So on Monday for the regular episode at 7:30. Eastern Time, Monday night, is going to be a panel on Biden and U.S. Empire with Daniel Bessner, Katie Halper, and Rania Kalik. Looking forward to that. On Wednesday, they're going to continue the Wednesday movie review live stream. Actually, Bessner's going to be back for that, along with a couple other people. We're going to talk about Dr. Strangelove. And Sunday, actually, I'm not quite sure yet, but there is going to be something for the Sunday debate live streams. But let's get right to this. I don't want to deprive Bhaskar of too much football tonight, with by going late.
Yeah. I mean, I have a good feeling that we're gonna have a fun Super Bowl. Like I think either Brady or Rodgers being in there. It looks like Brady, given how the game is going, will be fun. Like I hated Brady for all these many years, but he's just so old that I think it's kind of incredible that he's still out there. So I wouldn't mind seeing him in the Super Bowl again. Then ideally he would lose to the Buffalo Bills, which will continue his record against New York football teams, and make it 0-3 in Super Bowl. So, that's my fanfic. So we'll see what happens.
I mean, as you know, I kind of have a actually. So I guess like Christopher Hitchens, Tom Brady is a problematic person. I have a big soft spot for, which because that was the interesting trivia. The first ever article that I published in Jacobin was partially had to do with Deflategate and all of that.
Yeah, I think he was persecuted by evil powers, the NFL office, but that doesn't mean we defend him. In my opinion, you might defend him in that particular persecution. It's like Milosevic up for war crimes. You both dislike the international authorities bombing him, and also you see him as a massive criminal as well. So Tom Brady is Slobodan Milosevic.
Okay, you heard it here first.
you heard her like only. Like, I think that one might go unsaid for the rest of human history, and probably that'd be a good thing.
Fair enough. All right, let's get started.
Hello, my name is Phil Gaglio, and I'm president of the George Washington University Objectivist Club. I'd like to welcome you all here this evening.
That's
and thank
a student. He kind of looks and sounds like he's 45 years old.
Moral system. Before I introduce our 4 participants in tonight's debate, I'd like to let everyone know that the George Washington University Objectivist Club and the Program Board are the proud sponsors of this event. The Objectivist Club is an on-campus student organization whose goal is to provide the opportunity for all students to become acquainted with ideas which are pro-reason, pro-reality, and pro-individual rights. Members will be available at the table in the foyer during the break and for a brief period after the debate to provide information about objectivism and the club. Our next meeting is November 20th, a week from this Thursday, next door at the Marvin Center. Dr. Ed Locke, professor at the University of Maryland, will conduct a question and answer period on objectivism entitled, "Why Does Man Need a Philosophy? Why Objectivism?" The public is invited to attend this free meeting. For all those who are interested, there will be a reception for tonight's participants immediately following the debate. This should give you the opportunity to speak with our 4 guests on a more personal level. It will be held next door in the Marvin Center, room 501. Now, without further delay, I'd like to introduce tonight's participants.
So I went to GW and I edited the first issue of Jacobin in the Marvin Center.
Fair enough. Somebody who I'll leave nameless, but is a beloved member of our extended podcasting and Jacobin universe has just texted me. Is that Brett Kavanaugh who was just speaking? Which you can kind of see, but anyway.
Position will be Christopher Hitchens and John Judis. Mr. Hitchens received his graduate degree in philosophy, politics, and economics from Balliol College in Oxford, England. He currently writes a column called The Minority Report for The Nation magazine. He is also the current American columnist for The New Statesman, the primary publication of the social democratic political left in London, England. Mr. Hitchens has edited and written several books, including his recently published Cyprus. He frequently debates conservatives on radio, television, and campus forums, and has appeared on William Buckley's television program Firing Line. Mr. Judis received his M.A. in philosophy from the University of California at Berkeley. He is a founding editor of the Socialist Review and is currently senior editor of In These Times. He is on
so
the editorial
John
board
Judis moved over to the center left, or kind of center, but he's not nearly as bad as Hitchens' turn.
Will be published by Simon & Schuster in about a year. On your right, advocating the capitalist position, will be Harry Binswanger and John Ridpath. Dr. Binswanger received his PhD from Columbia University. He taught philosophy for many years at Hunter College in New York City. In 1979, he left the academic world to launch the Objectivist Forum, a magazine devoted to Ayn Rand's philosophy and its application to cultural issues. Dr. Binswanger's just published book, The Ayn Rand Lexicon, is a philosophical dictionary of objectivism. Dr. Binswanger has written and lectured extensively in support of the philosophy of objectivism. Dr. Ridpath received his master's degree in business administration from the University of Toronto and is a PhD in economics from the University of Virginia. He is currently an associate professor of economics and social science at York University in Toronto, where he has been the recipient of the prestigious award given by the Ontario Council of University Faculty Associations. Dr. Ridpath has been an advisor to the National Foundation for Public Policy Development, a Canadian think tank, and has spoken at the national policy conferences sponsored by the Canadian Progressive Conservative Party. Professor Stephen Keller Director of Debate here at the George Washington University, has graciously agreed to moderate tonight's intellectual combat. Professor Keller is with the Department of Communications and Theater and teaches a variety of public address courses here at GW. I'm sure you all join me in thanking tonight's participants for taking the time to present their views on this important question, and Professor Keller for his assistance in planning and executing this confrontation, and the GW Program Board for its sponsorship. Under debate this evening will be the morality of each opposing system, socialism versus capitalism. The participants are expected to defend each system by presenting the underlying ethical principles upon which it rests. They have been selected because they represent extreme polar opposite positions. I'm stressing that the issue here is morality, not economics alone. We are here to debate the fundamental moral alternatives, to focus on the essential conflict between two absolutely opposed systems, socialism and laissez-faire capitalism. Thank you.
I like how he says laissez-faire.
My guess is as the evening progresses, there will be very little question in your mind as to who is seated on the left and who is seated on the right. The intellectual enlightenment that will be served to us this evening will probably be very freewheeling. At the same time, it will have a time and a structure to it. The participants have agreed to the following speech sequence and time lengths. Each speaker, alternating back and forth between sides, will make an 8-minute opening statement. These opening statements will then be followed by each speaker making a 5-minute reply. After the opening statements and the reply, we very much encourage your participation. There will be a microphone set up at which you all are welcome to ask questions of the participants. Those questions can be directed to a particular participant or merely to a side. Following the questioning period, there will be a 4-minute per side closing statement. Those 4 minutes can be divided among the participants on that side, however they choose. Starting us off this evening will be Mr. Harry Binswanger. Mr. Binswanger.
Thank you. The opposition between capitalism and socialism is a moral opposition. Each side must state and defend the moral basis of its political views. We champion capitalism as the only moral political system. What is morality? Morality is a code of values to guide man's choices. There is only one fundamental choice: to live or not, to be or not to be. If one chooses to live, then one must act in a certain way. One must achieve certain goals, certain values. One must satisfy one's needs. If one does not choose to live, then no action and no values are possible or necessary. One simply sits and waits to die. Life, in other words, is the ultimate goal at the root of all values. Life is a self-justifying primary. This is why you need a morality. You need a moral code in order to know how to live. And that means that the standard of morality, the abstract principle by which we judge good and evil, is man's life. Every species has a specific means of survival set by its nature. This is a simple biological fact. Unlike the lower animals, man has the power of choice, but he doesn't have a choice over his basic nature and his basic needs. What is man's means of survival? How does man get his food, his shelter, his safety, his health, and so forth? Well, obviously not by any great strength of muscle or by claw or fang, not by instinct, but by thinking, by reason. Reason, the conceptual faculty, is man's basic means of survival. Now, this is the key to our whole position, so I want to stress this. Reason, thinking, the use of man's intelligence is his means of survival. Man survives not by appropriating pre-existing values the way that animals do, but by creating new values. The means of doing this is productive work, and by production, I mean the application of reason to reshaping matter to serve human ends. It is not true, in other words, that wealth exists in some static quantity, like a natural resource, so that when one person gets more, another automatically gets less. Life is not a zero-sum game. Wealth is created, it isn't found. And the creation of wealth takes knowledge. Knowledge is available only through rational thinking. Thus, reason is man's only means of knowledge and therefore his basic means of survival. Look around us. Right now, we're in a man-made world. We're in a man-made environment. Electric lights, plastic seats, clothes from artificial and natural fibers from all parts of the world, a microphone system. Where did all these things come from? They came from the minds of the scientists who discovered the physical laws involved, from the engineers who found out how to translate that abstract knowledge into working instruments, from the entrepreneurs who risked their capital to bring these things to a market to serve human needs, and in addition, the physical labor under the direction of the intelligence of the entrepreneur to produce them. The moving cause here, the basic source of all these things, is not then the physical labor as such. It's not muscle power. It is not that we expend more calories of energy per minute than the caveman, and that's why we are here in an auditorium lit by electricity, and he is in the cave. In fact, we put forth much less muscular labor today than in any time in human history. We even go out of our way to create exercise because we find ourselves doing so little in our work. The actual source of wealth then is man's mind, man's rational thinking capacity. Now, it is true that some men can attempt to live without using their minds, but they can do so only by parasitizing the wealth created by those who did choose to think and work. It is still true that man's life depends upon thinking, even though some people mooch or steal the products of the thinking of others. Those others had to think. Now, a morality whose standard is man's life, then, man's life as a rational, productive being, cannot permit such parasitism. A rational morality, such as we are advocating, does not advocate the master-slave relationship or the robber-victim relationship, but independence. Men must deal with each other as independent equals, each man being an end in himself, not the means to the ends of others. Each man must stand on his own, achieve his own values, live his own life, earn his own happiness. He does get, of course, a value from the association with others. He's not a hermit. But there be no mistake about what we're advocating. We are advocating selfishness, rational, egoistic selfishness as the proper code for men to deal with each other. The reason is that selfishness is required by life as such. The opposite of selfishness, which means the achievement of your own values, is the surrender of your values, the sacrifice of a higher value to a lower value, or the sacrifice of a value to a zero, to nothing. Now, that is obviously the antithesis of life. Life is a process of value achievement. Full surrender of all values would mean death. Anytime you eat a mouthful of food for yourself rather than giving it to some starving Indian beggar, you're doing that on the principle not of altruism or self-sacrifice, but of egoism.
Shout out to
Now,
all
I
the
want to be
Indian
clear,
beggars.
rational selfishness does not mean sacrificing others to yourself. That would be inconsistent. Each man must be selfish. Each man must live his own life, and men must trade value for value when they deal with each other. So we hold that man is born free, not only politically, but morally. You are not born in debt to others. You have no duties to others. You are not obligated to seek their happiness. You are the owner of your own life. Your life is not the means to any higher end. It is the ultimate end. As I said, it's your basic choice to live or not. Man is not a sacrificial animal. Now, in particular, we emphatically reject the idea that need is a claim. You know the slogan in the advertisement, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. We reject that because it's incompatible with human survival. A morality that sacrifices ability to need is a morality that holds suffering, lack, disease, impotence, failure as that which entitles one to receive values. The needs that must be considered are the needs of the producers, if you want to use that language. What social conditions are required for man to produce wealth? Well, since the production of wealth, I argued, is through reason, there's only one basic thing required. You must respect man's sovereign reason. This means one must oppose the use of physical force. One must deal with other men by persuasion, not by force. So a basic principle of capitalism is all interactions must be voluntary, because the forced is the anti-mind, and the anti-mind is the anti-life. Thank you.
All right. So a lot going on there. Life is good. Reason is good. Therefore, capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is that, well, obviously, at first it seems like he's going to totally ignore the labor of others, but then at least he gets to it. But he foregrounds, it's an interesting trick, because what he does, of course, is foreground the entrepreneur as a sort of genius and true wealth, and physical labor just being one small component. But then he flips it and then says that in the Marxist framework, the exploited, the workers, are in fact exploiting those who actually are directing production. And of course, in this kind of worldview or framework, every single capitalist is an entrepreneur, where of course we as socialists would differentiate properly between entrepreneurship, like the creation of new goods and services and techniques, with the ownership of private property. It is true that some capitalists are entrepreneurs, but most capitalists are not. They just happen to own the places where goods and services are produced. And the last thing is, like, obviously part of our view, and the view, I guess, on the book we're working on that we're making clear, isn't that capitalists are entirely parasites. There is something to the need for someone to take risks, to risk their capital, to try to bring new goods and services to market. Like, that entrepreneurship does have some value, but our view is that workers collectively, through the social ownership of production, through control, let's say, of their own firms, can replicate that productive function of capitalists in a condition without capitalist exploitation. I don't know. I'm sure you can articulate this much better, because this is your bread and butter, not mine.
Yeah. So I like that you tied it into the book that we're writing with Mike Beggs, the blueprint, which I'm gonna take me a while to to say that without smiling, but I like it. I like where we're going with that. So it's arrogant in a fun way, but yeah, no, absolutely. So I think the distinction about entrepreneurship and ownership is exactly right. So David Schweikart makes this very well in his book After Capitalism, that if entrepreneurship means sort of bringing together the different elements of production, which seems like is the minimum thing it could mean. Oftentimes there's this extra connotation of like coming up with specific innovations, which isn't, which goes beyond that. But if it means bringing together the various elements of production, deciding that that like this bit of physical property is going to be used to produce and sell this thing, then yeah, I mean, absolutely, those can come apart. I mean, it's not the system that we prefer as democratic socialists, but I mean, Soviet planners were entrepreneurs on that definition. Saudi aristocrats, operating through the state, Aramco, might be entrepreneurs on that definition. of course, the extra part, and it's something absolutely that workers can do collectively and democratically. And yeah, it has value, but just because the activity has value doesn't mean that the current system for who's allowed to do that activity with value is the best system.
And also, real quick, he doesn't bring up at all, and in his worldview, he can't really articulate who gets to be a worker and who gets to use achieve their potential and be able to use their entrepreneurial skills and move beyond manual labor like that. Because in his mind, there's something coercive about society trying to even equalize opportunity to the point that people can reach their potential. So even that kind of narrow goal of redistributing chance is forgiven in his view. And also, obviously, he has to make it sound like that very little of what's in society is kind of imputed from the past. Like, for example, a capitalist is not inventing, with the vast majority of capitalists is not inventing their supply chains and inventing labor techniques and inventing machinery. Machinery itself is just like dead labor power, basically. They're just utilizing and harnessing it based on a lot of advantages they've already had. But in his mind, it's like everything's blank. Then capitalists create meaning and value, and we're all just kind of riding the wave of really a few thousand incredible people.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. And yeah, and it certainly ignores how much ongoing innovation is done by employees, in research and development, departments and in major corporations, how much is done, as our friend Daniel Bester pointed out to me, by government, in government contexts, World War II, was one of, in one of the greatest sort of short periods of technological innovation, and an awful lot of that was happening either directly, in government contexts, or certainly in, publicly funded, in maybe quasi-private ones, but also at a time when we were probably the closest we've ever come to having a planned economy, centrally planned economy in the United States, and to this day, of course, even Lee Phillips and Mikhail Rozworski point out in People's Republic of Walmart, tons of most pharmaceutical innovation, most new molecular entities, genuinely new drugs, are developed in public labs, and all of that awkwardly fits. Absolutely, there's the whole question of who gets to be in this position in the first place, and everything that he's saying is about maybe allowing people who happen to be lucky enough to be in a position to develop their talents to do so. But his worldview can't let him say anything about, providing that opportunity for people who, due to the circumstances they're born into, might not be able to, might not have access to, to school, which, really in the Ayn Rand utopia, there wouldn't even be public, secondary education, never mind post-secondary. And then at the end, he says, well, force is bad, and he ties that together with the first stuff about life is good and reason is good, because force is the anti-mind, because reason is good, therefore force is bad. And I guess I was, the pedantic logic nerd in me wants to spend a lot of time going through why the initial steps of the argument are so weird, that because he says, oh, you can't, if you don't choose to live, then you can't, then, there's no point of values. And even that's a little unclear what it means. You could totally coherently think that you had a moral obligation to sacrifice yourself for others and, jump on a grenade or something. It's very unclear why he doesn't think that. Saying that reason is very useful. Well, lots of things are useful. Reason is certainly one of the most useful ones, but it's very unclear why that's supposed to justify the pride of place that reason has in this view. But I don't want to harp on all that too much, because even though his arguments for them are weird, like, okay, life, yay, reason, yay, fair enough, so far so good. But then this business at the end about force is the anti-reason, I think, is the place where he's, kind of going from the weird Ayn Rand stuff to more standard libertarian fare, that the problem with redistribution is that it's force. And there I would just say, like, the basic Matt Brunig argument has always struck me as the beginning and end of what needs to be said about this, which is that saying that it's bad to use force is either incoherent or uninformative. Because either, you really mean it, and you don't want to enforce any sort of rules about economic distribution, in which case we just live in the grab what you can world. Everybody can use whatever they want without property, there being no such thing as property. You just embrace and put on property as theft. Or what you really mean is unjustified force is wrong, which is invariably what libertarians mean by that. They're fine with...
Right. They don't want physical coercion. They don't want you to be able to hurt, like physically harm and physically steal in that sense. So therefore a very limited state that prevents that activity.
Yeah, although even there, right, like, sure, everybody agrees that all else being equal, physically hurting people is bad, but no libertarian is actually against using the threat or reality of physically hurting people to enforce property claims. That no trespassing will enforce that either directly, in an anarcho-capitalist.
But also our view is that collective action, be it at the trade union collective action or redistribution from a state, is in fact a form of coercion or force. It's just justified because it's coercion that limits the right of a minority to extend rights and freedoms to a majority, and it's within reason. So, for example, we would be against the state physically harming someone or executing someone or doing those sorts of things, because that violates their individual rights. But we just don't believe that logic extends to bourgeois property rights. And in fact, the majority class has to recourse to collective action and the institutions of the state and the trade union and so on, in order to do what a capitalist can do more individually, exert power at the shop floor.
Yeah. Right. So I think that the core of the Brunig point I've always understood to be that we all actually agree that when it's justified, when it's within reason, it's okay to use the threat or reality, physical force, to enforce whatever whatever you think the right economic distribution is, whether that's calling the cops to because to protect your shop, as a shop owner, which any libertarian is fine with, unless they're like an anarcho-capitalist, in which case you should call the private security agency to do that, or whether it's what we think, which is that you can have you can nationalize things, or you can have a system of taxation that's enforced ultimately by force, but the difference isn't really, like, the force thing is ultimately a red herring. The difference isn't really physical force, good or bad. The difference is what counts as a justified use of force, which is ultimately going to be about what your theory of justice and distribution is. Is it just that everybody's entitled to whatever they end up with, letting the chips fall where they may in a free market, and then we should enforce that against theft and other things? Or is it that, considerations about fairness or giving people, substantive equal opportunity, or control over their lives at work, things like this are relevant. And I agree that, like, the right theory of that is going to be one that says, like, there are limits to how much you can enforce, use force for, to enforce considerations about, I know that was a weird sentence, use force to enforce, but, you can enforce considerations about fairness and the rest. Like, G.A. Cohen has that nice example about, the eyeball lottery, that if the state was requiring people to submit to having their eyeballs taken out and transplanted into the eye sockets of blind people, that would be too much. But that's one way of framing what the fundamental difference is. Like, I know one of the reviews at the time it was published of Robert Nozick's book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, was I don't remember who wrote the review, but the line sticks in my head is I refuse to believe that I have nerve endings in every dollar in my bank account, which is essentially the issue, right? Is economic redistribution really like that eyeball lottery thing, or is it okay? But these are the kinds of considerations that you're only going to have to start thinking about once you admit that that fairness, or even just like keeping people from dying of easily treatable diseases, or extending substantive democracy into the workplace, are the kinds of things that factor into sort of distribution you should enforce. Whereas what this guy thinks is just the distribution that you should enforce, and again, he's not a pacifist, that's a red herring, but the distribution that you should enforce is just letting everybody keep whatever they end up with in a free market process.
So I guess now we're moving on to John Judis, who today is honestly one of the few decent liberals to the extent of you could actually have an argument with him, because he's materialist. And I was surprised to find out of how adamant a socialist he was during this time. And he started off writing for Socialist Revolution, which became the Socialist Review, which became In These Times. And at this point, I think he's the editor of In These Times. He, I guess, followed Weinstein to be the editor of In These Times. So anyway, John Judis, I think, is next, because I think it's been a while since I watched this, but I think they let Hitchens go last.
Yeah. Also, I wouldn't forgive myself. I didn't bring this up. The like everybody else on the right who likes to quote that passage, I don't think this guy has any idea what "from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs" actually means in context. Because it's one of those things. It's like how every conservative knows that Martin Luther King said the thing about the content of your character, but they don't know anything else about what he said. Every right winger knows that Marx said, from each according to your abilities, to each according to your needs, which is actually like an old, French socialist slogan. He didn't come up with that, but what it means in context in the critique of the Gotha program is that he first talks about a phase of socialism in which you would still, you would have to have some controls about what was distributed to who. And then
on the basis of work, which is the socialist logic, which is distribution on the basis, fair distribution on the basis of work, as opposed to the communist logic in the future.
Yeah, exactly. And the reason he thinks you can get from one to the other, and we can argue about the extent to which this even makes sense, or it's a realistic prediction or whatever, but just to understand the position, the reason he thinks that you can go to that communist logic in the future is that he thinks that that as cultural, you have cultural changes from the capitalist past as people are habituated into socialism, and as you have further technological progress giving us superabundance, then you don't really need to sweat so much people being compensated in some way that's ultimately based on what they put into the system originally, because there's going to be so little work that still has to be done by humans that everybody just kind of, pursuing their own projects will get it done. And there's going to be so much to go around that everybody can just kind of take what they need. That's what he means in context by it. But the way that people like this objectivist guy always make it sound is almost the opposite of that. It makes it sound like there's going, that like Marx is envisioning there's some bureaucratic committee that's making evaluations about who has which abilities and who has which needs, and making distributive choices according to that, which even if you don't think that Marx's actual vision is realistic or whatever, just really could not possibly be further from what he's saying.
Yeah, it's a philosophical statement about future abundance. Well,
exactly. All right, let's do Judas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Binswanger. Mr. Judas will join the debate.
I was happy to learn that we would be having a debate between socialism and laissez-faire capitalism, because I'm uncomfortable debating capitalism rather than laissez-faire capitalism. Since I stand for a fleeting ideal myself, I prefer to have to contend with another fleeting ideal. I should warn you that my views as a socialist are not necessarily representative of all socialists. In one sense, I'm a radical. In another sense, I'm a conservative. I'm radical, I suppose, in the sense that I don't think that the German Democratic Republic, the East Germany, is either democratic or socialist. And I'm conservative in the sense that I think that socialism itself will evolve out of capitalism and share many of the features of modern democratic capitalism. Not only the parliamentary system and civil liberties, but also the rudiments of the market and small and medium-scale private property as well. Now, what is the moral basis of socialism as I describe it? Well, I'm going to say something that might seem paradoxical here, and that is that the moral basis of socialism is really no different than that of laissez-faire capitalism. Socialism comes out of the failure of laissez-faire capitalism to realize its own ideals. Those ideals are basically three. One, which Harry Binswanger discussed, is an ideal of man himself, of human beings themselves, having a higher capability and of society itself being structured in such a way as to fulfill that higher capability. It's an ideal that comes from the Greeks, goes through Hegel, the Enlightenment thinkers. The other ideals are those of liberty and equality, and those were born out of the struggle to wrest capitalism out of feudalism. Liberty as the right to be free of inherited obligation, to be born not on a manner in which one's life was laid before him, but to have the possibility of doing different things with one's life. Equality, again, as being born neither in a particular caste or class, a rough equality, but an equality based on the absence of an aristocracy. Now, these three ideals of what one might call self-creativity, equality, and liberty were the ideals that informed Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, what one might call the democratic tradition in American thought. And the way that they conceived them being fulfilled was in terms of a society of equal small producers in which each person or family would be roughly equal, would be free, and would have the power to control their own destiny in society. Unfortunately, these dreams were not realized. Instead of a society of small producers, we had a society of large producers, a society of classes, a society in which poverty existed alongside great wealth. In other words, the society that we know as modern capitalism today. And socialism, as an idea of the 19th century, was born precisely out of the understanding that that society of laissez-faire capitalism could never be, and that in order to realize it, you would have to have a somewhat different kind of society, one in which human beings themselves owned the means of production, in which there were no classes. Now, here's the difficult part, because, as I said at the beginning, I'm a radical in the sense that I don't think that what we have today under the name of socialism is socialism. And I think we'll get to talk about that a little more in the debate, but let me just briefly explain what I'm talking about. Marx and the early socialists always assumed that socialism would arise only in highly industrialized societies with a democratic tradition. Highly industrialized because only in those societies would people have the time, would the productivity exist, in other words, where people would have the time to rule themselves. Democratic because only in those societies would people be educated, both in trade unions and parliament, to rule themselves. But socialist movements first took power not in highly industrialized societies, but in a semi-industrialized nation with a very scant democratic tradition, the Soviet Union, Russia. And socialism itself, as it evolved, came to be not so much a specific social system after the name of Marx, but rather a means of vindicating or legitimizing a movement that stood for something quite different for socialism. Most of the societies that call themselves socialism are no more socialist than most of the right-wing movements that call themselves democratic. I'm sure you know there are those. Now, the question is socialism itself, as I'm describing it, possible? Is it possible to fulfill this dream of liberty, equality, and self-creativity? There's a problem not only with existing socialist societies and the pall that they've cast over our notion of what it is to be socialist, but there's a problem, in fact, with Marx himself and the socialists of the 19th century. In my opinion, there's a fundamental error in Marxist thought, and that is what Marx understood, and the heart of what's valuable of Marx is that one society evolves out of the other. It both absorbs part of another society and it negates part of another society. That's going to be true of an economy of a socialist society. That is, we cannot conceive of what Marx conceived of as a socialist economy was simply the negation of a capitalist economy in which no markets existed and in which economic power would be concentrated in the collectivity. What happened as a result of that is that the collectivity became the state. The state itself became ruled by a political elite. And as Hayek and von Mises and various other thinkers warned, one laid the basis, on behalf of Marxism, one laid the basis for totalitarianism. So what I'm describing as Marxism would have to be, in fact, a mix of laissez-faire capitalism and Marxism. What is called in the world today market socialism, but market socialism founded upon democracy. Thank you.
All right. Maybe I'll let you kick us off, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, it's that I think that the way that he was argued for socialism there is one that I'm very, very fond of. I think that there's strands certainly within classical Marxism, both of doing exactly this and strands of classical Marxism that are about not doing this. But it's saying that the ideals of the classical bourgeois revolutions can only be fully realized by moving from capitalism to socialism. So, or you could even go like you could make the same point without going quite as far back as 1789 by talking about like Abraham Lincoln, who has speeches where he talks about how for the sake of human freedom, nobody should spend their entire life as a wage laborer. It's an interesting kind of transitional fossil between the classical bourgeois revolutions and socialism, because of course what Lincoln wasn't advocating wasn't collective ownership of the means of production in order to get rid of the distinction between capitalist and wage laborers. What he was advocating was that everybody should at a certain point in their life be a independent proprietor, a small farmer,
small holding Republican democracy. But yeah, I totally agree that basic point of saying that capitalism both makes possible the fulfillment of some of these long deferred Enlightenment dreams of liberty, of equality, of fraternity, but it also ultimately blocks their fulfillment and perpetuates new forms of exploitation and so on. It's quite rhetorically effective. I think it makes a lot of sense. And I have lots of quibbles with little things that Judas says along the way. I think it's worth noting that he's doing this in the 1980s, right? Not a very easy time. And he's obviously speaking to what seems to be a more conservative crowd at an event hosted by, an Ayn Rand Institute, an objectivist club. So you could kind of understand why he's playing some of these rhetorical games. I mean, the one thing that I really object to, or at least I would say that it seems a bit cheap, is just to merely say, and I understand why he's doing it tactically, but to say that the Soviet Union and that experience has nothing to do with socialism. I think it makes more sense for us to say it was, one, explain the roots of it, but also say it was a bad attempt at socialism that didn't fulfill the objectives that we believe in socialism. Like, for example, a lot of his emphasis on what the Soviet Union, how it uses socialism, is as a ideological justification for its form of rule, which he classifies as totalitarian. I don't think that's the best framework to understand what the Soviet Union was. But beyond that, like, I think that Soviet Union and its leaders used socialism and used it to justify collective ownership of the means of production, not necessarily just to perpetuate the rule of a class of bureaucrats, but to justify and create the conditions for a catch-up with the West. Like, I think you could view it as like an authoritarian form of a development state, rather than view it as something a little bit differently. And also beyond that, like, it's a society in which there is no capitalist class, where there is state ownership of the means of production and exchange. Like, it is qualitatively different than capitalism. I obviously, if anyone knows my work, I think it's a bad society worthy of criticism, but I'm always wary of the no true Scotsman thing, which these libertarians constantly do, where they say, this isn't capitalism, this is something else, we want capitalism. And I just always feel like for neutral people, that's a cheap shortcut. So if we say this isn't socialism, real socialism will be good and this is bad, therefore it's not real socialism. I just think it just doesn't have enough substance. Much better to say that socialism has different strands and different traditions, and we believe in a democratic socialism predicated on civil rights and freedom, rather than on authoritarianism.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little ambivalent about that question. So I do have an argument in my first book, give an argument that that it's not really no true Scotsman, because it's not an ad hoc redefinition of socialism. It's the idea that socialism means at its core the extension of democracy into the economic realm is an original definition of socialism, which is the basis by which people like Max Shachtman or Hal Draper, Michael Harrington argued that even if the Soviet Union was qualitatively different from capitalism, it was also qualitatively different from socialism. It was its own thing.
Right. Harrington used bureaucratic collectivism to describe the system.
Yeah.
I forget to use bureaucratic collectivism to describe capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess, and I guess to be fair, using the three people I just named were all bureaucratic collectivism theorists. Although, also I guess that's an interesting name, because even though what they meant by it was that it was a third thing besides capitalism and socialism, even the name, right, has collectivism in it, kind of gestures at the idea that there's something socialistic-y, about the Soviet system. But I think my position now is, I actually wrote something about this for a Eastern European magazine called The Barricade. It's called How Should the Contemporary Socialist Left Relate to the History of, quote, actually existing socialism, unquote. And I think that they're ultimately, the labeling question isn't really worth getting hung up on, because clearly there are ways of explaining what socialism means that go all the way back to the beginning of the socialist tradition, on which the Soviet Union would count, and there are ways of explaining what socialism means that go way back in the beginning of the socialist tradition, under which it wouldn't count. And I think where I am sympathetic with the No True Scotsman worry about it is that it is cheap if it's used as a sort of get out of jail free pass for thinking about the problems of the Soviet system. It's like, oh, that has nothing to do with us because that's not what we advocate. When like it's very plausible that a lot of the problems that afflicted the Soviet system, with that form of economic planning, would have afflicted a version that was more democratic than what existed in the Soviet Union. So the little simple-minded thought experiment I always like to trot out is, imagine the Soviet Union, but a version of it where they had multi-party elections and some sort of mechanism for making the media independent of this, independent of state censorship, and so they had free speech and free press and multi-party elections, and whichever party won, a parliamentary majority in that year's election got to appoint the head of, Gosplan, the Soviet planning office. And I'm sure that would have been way better than the Soviet system that existed in many, many ways. I'm sure it would have avoided like the real horrors, like the Ukrainian famine. But I'm not convinced that it would have avoided the kind of day-to-day frustrations of Soviet citizens, whose consumer needs weren't being met, and which was a powerful thing in alienating people from that system. All of which, and then this is the point where some people just start hand waving about how we could have super direct democracy and that'll solve all these problems. But I think at the very least, obviously that's not where we go in the book, but at the very least, I think the burden of proof is on anybody who wants to say that.
Yeah, and even some parts of the party state, the party part of the party state actually served a vital role in that this party cadre were the only people who could figure out problems in the economy and basically say, okay, this tractor factory needs extra inputs beyond what they were allotted in their plan. There's this shortage here. So in fact, one thing that happened in the later Gorbachev years was they attempted to cut out the bureaucracy and some of the political role of these party cadre, but they ended up cutting out the necessary shortcuts and made a dysfunctional system function, even poorly function. But anyway, all that's to say, I think Judas overall does a good job, quibbles aside, especially keeping in mind that he's in the 1980s. I think that nowadays, if we're ever to summon the American democratic system, we'd probably skip Jefferson and especially Jackson and just go to Thomas Paine and Lincoln and some other thinkers. But yeah, overall, I think it's a strong case.
Yeah, no, that all seems exactly right. I would say, I mean, I think with the, and I do agree that I think probably at the very least the most rhetorically effective strategy for talking about the Soviet Union is just to say I make it clear that we take it serious, we take that historical experience seriously in both learning the negative lessons about the inefficiencies and the political authoritarianism, and I think also at this point the positive lessons in 1986. That's probably a little harder to say, but I think now with a little retrospect, say there are things that system did well. We don't have to lie about that either. But we can just have a balanced view while also making clear that it's not the model that we advocate. But yeah, okay, let's keep going.
The debate this evening is in essence about two issues. The first issue is why the initiation of physical force is immoral. And the second issue is which social system employs the initiation of physical force and which social system rejects it. Professor Binswanger has addressed himself to the question of what are the standards of moral value that we employ in arguing for capitalism, and I'm going to apply what he has said to the question of capitalism as a social system. I'd like to start by observing that a society is nothing more than a collection of individuals who are interrelating with each other according to rules, laws, customs, which pertain in that culture. If one asked, what is at the basis of these rules and these laws, one would discover that at the basis of these things lie certain philosophical principles, such as we have been discussing. Principles with regards to the nature of reality, the nature of man, what man's social needs are. That is why philosophical principles are at the heart of a social system. A social system, capitalism, socialism, whatever you like, the essence of these social systems is philosophical principles which underlie them. The fundamental identifying characteristic of any social system is the set of moral and philosophical principles which it embodies. And this debate really is about the differing principles underlying socialism and capitalism. Now, before discussing capitalism as a social system, I want to remark on the state, on government as the central social institution. It is the enforcer of the laws, of the principles which are in place in the culture. It is the central social institution. It is the, if you like, dominating social institution in a culture. If we would ask ourselves, what is the government? What is the state as a social institution? What is its essential defining characteristic? We would see that the essential defining characteristic of government is that it is that social institution that has a legal monopoly over the use of force in society. That is what government is. The central question with regards to any social system, therefore, is what are the principles dictating the way that the state relates to its individual citizens? Now, what would a moral social system be? A moral social system would be one which was based on pro-life principles, one which was based on the values that human life requires, one that serves man's life rather than destroys man's life, one in which the government is limited in its functions to the social requirements of human life. In other words, the moral social system would be one which acknowledged and protected man's fundamental social need, which is for freedom from the initiation of physical force in a social context. Now, it is the concept of man's rights which captures man's need to be left free from the initiation of physical force on the part of his neighbors when he deals with them in society. It is man's right to life, liberty, private property, and the pursuit of happiness, which morally sanctions his need for freedom. The individual is a sovereign entity. His life belongs to him. It does not belong to anybody else, and it is immoral of anybody else or any social institution to attack him, to violate his rights, and force him to live for the needs of others. Man needs freedom to act. He cannot be physically barred from acting once he has decided through the irrational use of his mind on the goals he wishes to pursue. And if he should succeed in his actions, in gaining values, he needs the right to own those values and to retain them for his own use. He needs the right to private property. Without property rights, no human life is possible. The principle of man's rights is the bridge from morality to the question of the moral social system. The only moral social system, therefore, is the system which is based on the recognition of man's rights, on the recognition of man's need to be free from physical force. The only moral social system is that social system where the government is limited to this function, where it never initiates force in order to violate the rights of its own citizens, where it supplies the police, the armed forces, and the courts for dealing with rights violations, and in which it has no economic functions whatsoever. Just as state should be separated from church, state should also be properly, totally separated from economics. Now, the proper definition of capitalism as a social system is to identify the fundamental principle underlying capitalism. The fundamental moral principle underlying capitalism is the sovereign individual and his right to his own life and his own property. Therefore, the proper definition of capitalism is, it is the social system based on the uncompromising recognition and protection of individuals' rights. This is a definition in terms of fundamentals. Now, the socialists define capitalism as a social system where there is wage labor and where there is private property in the means of production. These are derivatives. It is true that there is private property in the means of production. It is true that there is wage markets, a market for wage labor. But these are expressions of every individual's right to act on his own, in his own interest, and trade accordingly and voluntarily with his fellow men. So to identify capitalism as a social system exhibiting wage labor and private ownership of the means of production is superficial. The fundamental and proper definition of capitalism is that it protects every man's right to his own life. Now, the implications of properly defining capitalism are, first of all, that there is in a true capitalist society no connection between economics and politics. Economic power, which is earned by producers by virtue of their ability to produce values which other people will buy, is a positive. It is a benefit to everybody to have present in our society people who are capable of earning economic power. Political power, on the other hand, is based on the power of a gun, on the power of the government to actually violate men's rights, coerce them, expropriate their property, and it is a negative. And there is no connection in a capitalist social system, if it's properly understood, between business and government. Secondly, there is no advocation in capitalism of the right to goods per se. People only have the right to act freely. They do not have the right to the goods of others. There is no such thing as a right to a job. In other words, to force another person to give you a job. A right to an education. In other words, to force another person to give you an education, or a right to any such possessions at all. Now, given this, it is obvious that capitalism has never yet fully existed in human history. It lies ahead rather than behind. The 19th century in Britain, in the United States, are the closest approximations of it, and we see great productivity and benevolence. The moral is the practical. But today we have no examples of capitalism in the world. We only have mixed systems, which in fact are systems of incompatible principles. Principles of statism, such as the socialists put forward, and some vestiges of freedom. Now, it is my view that having completed our comments, that we as a capitalists have done what is required of us, which is to make a case for capitalism. That is our case for capitalism as the only moral system available to man. Thank you.
So, first of all, I feel bad for these guys because they're in the 1980s with Thatcher and Reagan, reigning, and they're just complaining. Like they are miserable. They don't think they're winning. It's pretty sad to see that. And also, he really lets slip, like in his examples, which is really why I like the objectivists, because I think they're very, very honest. That he doesn't believe, he thinks even the state enforcing a right to education is a form of force and violence. But, an primary education for children, this is basically what they're trying to create. They're trying to create a class system so entrenched that almost everything is decided at birth about what you decide to endow to your family members, your children in this sort of society. Because the vast majority of laborers wouldn't even have the means and opportunity in this society. They want to give their children the chance to become literate, or in other words, the chance to become members of the managerial or capitalist stratum. So it's very naked in the example that he used. He's not trying to win over any intermediate people. He just gets right to, first from the right to housing, which I think at the time, majority of people would probably agree with. Then he jumps to education.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is, in fact, we can, I think, go a step beyond just saying that, there wouldn't be any, public schools in his society. He said that he wants, a complete separation of government from economy, like the separation of church and state. And I mean, I think I've seen a couple of other, objectivists say this before, and I always wonder how literally they mean that, because it's worth like taking a beat to think about what that would look like. Because if you have a complete separation of government from economy, that means that you can't have currency in the usual sense, at least, like not any kind of state. The government wouldn't be in the business of minting currency, or else clearly, the government and the economy are fairly entangled. And I mean, I guess maybe you can argue that there would be, obviously at 1986 they wouldn't say Bitcoin, but that you don't need government mandated currency. You could make some kind of speculative argument about that. But I think the one reason to sort of dwell on this kind of pedantic point is that, when people like him say, we don't have real capitalism, we only have some sort of mixed thing. They'll usually also, say that everything good about the current economy in terms of its ability to grow and thrive and be productive and dynamic is due to the capitalist elements of the mixture. But that gets a lot less plausible when you keep in mind that minting currency is statist, that having limited liability corporations is statist, that I'm not quite sure where the Ayn Randites come down on intellectual property, but that's something that some hardcore libertarians don't like, because they think it's too statist. And it's not at all obvious that I'm blanking on her name, the woman who wrote that private government book, Elizabeth Anderson, I want to say. Anyway, has made this point. I know that it's not at all obvious that an economy where you didn't have any of those things could be anything like as thriving and dynamic and productive as the one that you have right now.
Yeah. I mean, it's an extremist position. This is why they're kind of easier people to argue against, because they don't admit market failure, and a lot of defenders of capitalism do admit market failure. They don't see any role for the state, or in certain variants, the objectivists will concede to, again, like roads and certain infrastructure, plus the state enforcing laws, and the laws, as far as property goes, limited to just prevention of theft and physical violence and force. But yeah, naturally, it wouldn't be a very dynamic system, because capitalists themselves are quite good at orienting themselves towards short-term priorities, and very bad at medium and long-term priorities. Not because they're too stupid to realize that they need to invest in the future, but because the market imperatives, the imperatives of competition, always, sometimes make it very difficult for them to put aside money for research and development, or to deal with certain collective action problems like climate change, for instance. A lot of smart capitalists know that climate change might actually directly impact them and their businesses and their livelihoods and so on. But there's nothing for them to do as individuals, because if they try to do or act in such a way that reduces emissions at the cost of their bottom line, obviously they're just making themselves less competitive in the marketplace. Peers that aren't doing those things.
Yeah, it's also worth going back earlier in his comments, to the philosophical basis. Again, he talks about initiation of force. I don't want to beat this dead horse too much, but what counts as initiation of force is purely a function of who you think has a right to what. So if because that's why it's not initiation of force to recover stolen property, because you think that the person who's doing the recovering has a right to it. But this is the Brunig point, that if you this can't be a legal right that we're talking about, because if it was a legal right, if that was the issue, then taxation couldn't be theft, because because the IRS has a legal claim on a certain portion of your income. It has to be a moral right. And so then the real question is, why is it that you think that everybody has a moral right to whatever it is that they end up with in a free market process, ultimately tracing back to some extreme and historical injustices? And the argument that he makes for that in this presentation is he talks a lot about the right to life, and then he does this interesting move where he says, property is necessary for life. So what he's actually doing is, even though overall he's acting as if he's just arguing from first principles, there's a consequentialist argument that's snuck in the middle that, like, okay, well, because it's important that people be able to live and thrive and all that stuff, and you couldn't have that in the, grab what you can world where there were no property claims, that everybody could just take whatever they wanted, no matter who was currently in possession of it, which is okay, reasonable. That would be chaos. But then there's this huge leap there because, okay, you need to have some sort of property arrangements, but that doesn't mean you have to keep whatever currently happens to exist in any society, that you couldn't redistribute, that you couldn't that you couldn't transfer, businesses into the hands of, of workers or communities. Certainly that you couldn't have, taxation for a welfare state. And in fact, if consequentialist arguments are on the table now, because, anything that's, life is good, therefore anything that's necessary for life is good, then you have to, then you just open the door for all kinds of things, that you can't, having access to medical care is necessary for, for continued life, so we can have to have single payer. Plixiplox, thank you for the super chat. Says it's strange that Rand never had any children in her works. Feels like an admission that having children are not compatible with her philosophy. Well,
I think it is. I get the joke, but it's funny because the question of children comes up multiple times later in this debate, which in funny ways from what I remember. But I think that in this case, having children being a relationship, an exchange between two people that share values or whatever else, deciding to have children, then her deciding to bestow resources upon her own children, or her, let's say, even deciding to bestow resources on someone else's child through charity. I think that's something that's not necessarily incompatible with her worldview, as long as it was initiated by kind of this voluntary thing. And then I think the objectivists would say the reason why I'm giving charity is because I'm getting more out of it. The act of benevolence is of value to me. But maybe, again, I'm in your terrain when it comes to these. No,
that all sounds right. It's kind of a funny way to put it. So where do babies come from? Well, voluntary exchange between self-interested agents. Look, I think that that's all. That's all correct.
It's funny because we're talking about sex.
Yes, that would be the joke. Yes. So yeah, I think that's all right. I think that's what that's what she would say. Speaking
of sex, she obviously thought a lot about it, because her books are mostly, like, a lot of their success has to do with, like, the fact there's a lot of, like, bad pop writing that's, like, borders on erotica, much like huge parts of George R.R. Martin's books as well. Those two authors often remind me of each other in how they write sex scenes.
Fair enough. Never read any George R.R. Martin, so I'll have to take your word for it there. I watched a little bit of the HBO show. But yeah, I think, and there was a question in the chat earlier, which is relevant, which was why objectivists bother to argue that capitalism is good for everybody if they're going to, exalt selfishness. And I think the basic reason is that they're going to say that, like, everybody should be interested in promoting capitalism because it's going to be good for them. Rand sometimes says that the interests of rational people can't come into conflict, because they're all going to be served by having, free markets and all of that. But in any case, that's obviously an expression, of hope. It's kind of a there's really no rational reason to think that the interests of rational people can't conflict. They certainly seem to all the time. It's certainly a very odd fit, with Rand's atheism, because without some sort of benevolent force to make sure that happens, there's really no guarantee that you're not going to get that in some situations. But I think despite everything you said being true, it's just all right. So just taking a moment out to block the person saying transphobic things in the chat.
To coerce and use force on.
Yes, that's right. That's right. To coercively use force in order to give everybody a pleasant chat experience. But in any case, even though that's true, that that it's not technically inconsistent with everything that she's saying, I think that the issue of children does really get at one of the reasons why it's the most implausible to sort of say, oh, don't worry about it. Everybody just pursuing their self-interest, works out well for everyone. And this goes back to something you said earlier, because if in an objectivist utopia, you don't have you don't even have public schools, then that's maybe going to be a system that's going to be in the interests of people who happen to be born into affluent families, but it's not at all going to be in the interests of people who are born who are born into to working class families where they're not going to have access to education. They're not going to be able to develop their talents, their reason, in the ways that objectivists exalt. They're not going to be able to flourish and live up to their potential. They're not going to be able to to contribute entrepreneurial innovation to society, even because they're just never going to have access to that in the first place.
Shall we move on to the main attraction?
Absolutely. So we've been going for quite some time, and of course, this is the part of it that I think we're most eager to see. So let's watch Christopher Hitchens, 1986, with the flock of seagulls haircut.
Thank you, Mr. Ridpath. Mr. Hitchens will be making the final 8-minute statement.
Thank you, Professor. I think that the organizers of this meeting are to be congratulated on their brio and also, I think, on their timing. We are met today as witnesses of the decomposition of a political regime in this capital city, which uses the language of capitalism and of free enterprise, employs the ideology of selfishness and self-interest, and stresses the rhetoric of laissez-faire, while bloating and expanding the role of the state, debauching the treasury and the currency, and relying upon a state within a state for the secret conduct of most policy. There may, and I think there will not be, any convergence of ideas between socialist and capitalist schools this evening, but this need not prevent us, I think, from seeing that a regime may combine the basest features of statism and collectivism with the basest elements of utilitarianism and libertarianism too. And I think if we recognize that, we may have ground for debate. What is it, I better get on with it, to be a socialist? Necessary conditions in my submission, rather than sufficient ones, must include the following. It is necessary to hold, firstly, that all divisions of class, nation, race, and sex are, in the last resort, man-made and can be man-unmade, are in no sense part of a divine or natural ordinance, and that we are members, like it or no, of one race, the human race. That civilization is, in fact, second, a cooperative enterprise. Whether the cooperation is coerced, as it was in most of recorded history, or voluntary, as has been occasionally found and can still be found in our century. But that it is a cooperative enterprise cannot be denied. There is no other means, that's to say, of civilization. Third, that the limits of creative endeavor are set by the limits of nature, and that very few human actions can therefore be said in the last instance to be entirely private. The earth is, in point of fact, a common treasury, as the English levelers used to say in the Puritan Revolution, hoping that it were so. It is, in fact, the case, and again, whether we like it or not, whether we care to treat it as such or not. Fourth, that there is no God and no supernatural, that this recognition obliges us morally to maximize the felicity of the one life that we are permitted. And fifth, that the principle of from each according to his ability or her ability, and to each according to his or her need, is an easily realizable one, prefigured already in human society by the working principles of the bourgeois family. That unique engine of thrift, enterprise, the transmission of morality, operates precisely on the principle of from each according to his or her ability and to each according to his or her need. There is, in fact, no other way that a family could decently or possibly be run. I make no moral judgment as between the decency and the possibility. Such a distinction would be odious. Marxists describe freedom as the recognition of necessity, and only then proceed to say that the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all, a stipulation that obviously implies its corollary, that the educator must be educated. That's why I stress the above as necessary conditions rather than sufficient ones. We do not ask for these things to be true. We might even prefer them not to be, but we must recognize them as given and as such. Sufficient conditions, I think, center on the question of class. Marxists recognize that history is indeed the contest of competing social forces, and that so is the present such a competition. All attempts to describe society as merely organic and harmonious, or as a free competition or race between individuals with differing attainments and endowments, fail, because they ignore this simple and obvious fact, which again we do not preach, we simply recognize, insist upon, and make as a point of departure. Let me, if I may, quote you from Marx and Engels' preface to the German Ideology in 1845, where they say that they and their supporters, and I'm quoting now, "We do not preach morality at all. They do not put to people the moral demand, love one another, do not be egotists, etc. On the contrary, they are very well aware that egoism, just as much as selflessness, is in definite circumstances a necessary form of the self-assertion of individuals." I think this shows clearly enough that Marxists understand what Randians term, as if they discovered it, the virtue of selfishness. But as Marx and Engels also wrote in the same period in their Holy Family, they saw the need for selfishness to be transcended. I'm quoting again directly from the Holy Family, 1845 also. "If enlightened self-interest is the principle of all morality, man's private interest must be made to coincide with the interest of humanity. If man is shaped by environment, his environment must be made human." It is on this apparent paradox that we take our stand. And against the neo-Kantians, the early Marxists argued that morality could not be derived from abstract first principles of recht or right, but had to correspond to the real conditions of society. Nowadays, I think this argument seems quaint in its intensity and fervor, because evolution itself, and specifically the evolution of modern capitalism into a new symbiosis with the state, has borne in upon the dullest mind the recognition that if humanity does not yet think in terms of a common destiny, it has at least had to think in terms of a common fate. To put it at its most vulgar materialist level, we are all collectivized by the same ozone layer. The thermonuclear world is a great leveler, and just as there can be no purely moral, conscientious objection in a thermonuclear conflict, nor can there be any merely ethical or self-interested collaboration with it. Everybody, after all, in this auditorium is a uniformed conscript. You cannot conscientiously object to the nuclear conscription that has made of each of you soldiers and put you in the front line while the real soldiers are in the bunker. This recognition of reality enforces a sense of collective humanity upon us. Again, we do not preach this, we recognize it. Socialism, said Oscar Wilde, would free us from the distressing necessity of living for others. The feelings of compassion and solidarity and responsibility, after all, are no less instinct in our species than those of self-interest. It's precisely because these instincts of solidarity and compassion represent a human need, a need to be of help to others, a point very well made by Professor Richard Titmuss in his famous book, The Gift Relationship. Because they are a need, there is no need to make the sentimental presumption of altruism or to wrestle with the tautology that altruism represents. Marx and Engels, I'll close on this, in the preface to their 1848 manifesto, made capitalism a series of almost lyrical compliments. And in fact, few proponents of the capitalist system have ever summarized its virtues, those of creativity, innovation, the bursting of feudal and antique tribal fetters, as well as Marx did. But Marx and Engels also saw what's since become obvious, that capitalism is not the last word, and that in freeing mankind from ancient obligations, it made him a prisoner of market forces which also developed their own mythology and ideology, their own mystification, and their own bondage. Like Comrade Judice, I also believe that capitalism is the harbinger of socialism, that it's necessary not merely to contest or negate its ethical claims, but to transcend them, to build upon them. And from this, if I may coin a phrase, dialectic, I think we might get a truly human and unillusioned morality that was free from superstition or religion. On that realizable aspiration, I rest my case. Thank you.
Well, what's funny is that it was a lot more, it's different than I expected, in that it was a lot more materialist in many ways than Judas's explanation. It was probably more orthodoxly Marxist. If you probably take away his little aside about altruism, I think you could see a lot of logic in it. And obviously there's a love it or hate it kind of thing with some of his rhetorical tics and kind of Oxford education, like it or no. It's like certain things like that, which you could tell totally enraptured the American crowd. You know, you could say anything with a British accent, and middle-brow Americans like us will eat it up. Except for these particular people in this freeze frame, there's two guys in the audience who are definitely not pleased. But anyway, I'll let you dive into Hitch before I give more of my 2 cents.
Yeah, well, I mean, for sure, the power of the British, the Oxford, accent over Americans, can't be understated, overstated. But and I do think that this is part of why. In the last 10 years, when I think that in a lot of ways what he was saying was the least interesting, and even aside from the fact that I don't think it was right, I think that it was just the sort of pushing some basic atheist stuff, often tied with an overly simplistic view of the causal role of religion and various wars and stuff around the world, and then obviously the bad war on terror views. That's like the definitely the least interesting period of his life. But he said it so well, and the accent helped so much that I think that was able to I think that masked some of the real problems with it. So I think that's
it gave the media a reason to have him on, as opposed to other proponents of barbarity, because he was able to express it better. And then occasionally he would surprise you, like he'd be on Morning Joe, presumably to provide cover for some sort of imperialist expedition, and then all of a sudden start going on a rant about how the CIA should be abolished and all its agents should be arrested, and then just completely surprise and shock and confuse those people, and or occasionally throw in a column talking about some great work of proletarian literature from the early 20th century, or review quite well debate Robert Service on Trotsky, quite well. So it'd still show these little bits and pieces, but overall, I think by the end it was that the fact that what he was saying jives so well with conventional wisdom with it that way, but he said it differently, and with this other piece of knowledge that I think kind of got him more exposure. But if you look at the 80s and 90s, his best moments, his real TV moments, are mostly on C-SPAN, on book TV, which obviously was a bigger deal in the 80s than it is now, as opposed to later on when he got his, NBC hits and whatever else.
Yeah, sure. And I think because he said the status quo things better than anybody else they could have had on, he was tolerated in his little eccentricities, like wanting to abolish the CIA, and the fact that he was actually even in those last years, he was actually surprisingly decent on Palestine until the bitter end. And other things like this that came from his earlier his earlier worldview, which never entirely went away. And yeah.
So yeah, a couple things came to mind when the content of what he was saying. I think one is obviously his emphasis on nature and kind of common treasury. Sounds like a very modern eco-socialist-y view, but in fact, it's really in Marx too. If you read his critique of the Gotha program, he criticizes the Lassallean kind of view that labor is a source of all wealth, and I think somehow that view has been associated with orthodox Marxism, but Marx himself was critical of it. And just in general, it was good. Class analysis in the sense that it was anti-utopian, it situated Marx and Engels as people who weren't aiming for this kind of crude egalitarianism that was rooted in a voluntary abolition of egotism or selfishness. I think what their work got to is the fact that collective action against private property by workers was their route to express their individual interests. So in other words, if you're a worker in a factory, in order to be selfish and to fight for better wages and conditions, you had to figure out how to engage in collective action with other workers. And also at the same thing, at a social level, if you're a worker, you have to figure out how to aggregate your interests together politically with other workers in order to improve your lot in life as a class. And this is kind of what Marxists mean when we say that the working class is our agent of change and also is the universal class. It's a class whose particular interests jive with the generalized liberation of human beings. We don't focus on workers because they're the most oppressed or the most worthy of pity. It's because of this power and because of this fact that it's in our view the universal class.
Yeah, right, exactly. And I should say also in Critique of the Gotha program, not only does he say that labor isn't the source of all wealth, because nature also makes its contribution, but on the other end, he argues against what I think a lot of people would assume would be the classical Marxist position that under socialism workers will get the full value of their labor. He actually argues against that, partially on the grounds that you need to have, he wouldn't think of it as taxes exactly, but it says deductions to pay for things like schools and hospitals and other common needs. And also there's even a kind of half suggestion that it's unreasonable because different people have different capacities, and you don't want to have reward be based purely on that, even though he thinks it's kind of necessary for a certain stage that it's tied to that. All of which is just to say that, I think the picture a lot of people have of what the Marxist view is on labor and value and compensation is not is actually a view that he argued against, which is just an interesting historical point. But yeah, I think that what Hitchens says about altruism is good. That I think he doesn't spell it out that much, but he seems to be striking a reasonable balance between self-interest isn't illegitimate. In fact, as you point out, like the whole basis of the classical Marxist theory of change is that, you know, what's going to get people to enact socialism isn't mass altruism, but mass realization of collective interest. Although he's also not just doing like left objectivism, you know, he says, compassion and solidarity and all these things are as innate in us as selfishness, which I think is just an important point to make, because the way that Rand herself, if you read, like she wrote something called The Virtue of Selfishness, argues in the way that, contemporary Randians will argue, is, like they set it up as this false dichotomy between their position and being like a pure altruist who thinks that, you can never do anything for yourself because you should just be, constantly sacrificing your position to other people, which is, of course, not only clearly not, Marx and Engels' position, but also, honestly, that pure altruist straw man, like that really maybe certain strands of certain religious views, but like overall that matches up almost nothing in the entire history of philosophy.
Peter Phrase, the Jacobin writer, calls it basically elevating the worldview of a 13-year-old boy to that of a ideology, political ideology, which I think captures it pretty well. I have to relatively soon log off to watch the Bills. My fiance is a Bills fan, but I do have, I'm guessing we won't have a chance to get into the Q&A and stuff, but I do have a few questions for you. One of which is, okay, so we saw this debate with, or at least the opening statements of the debate with objectivists. In your experience, what group of capitalist apologists do you find it easiest and hardest to debate? Like on the extreme on the left, I guess, like social democrats who don't really believe that there's a route out of social democracy, like a Sherry Berman type. Then on the right, these like hard objectivist, I guess, like what's the easiest to tackle and the hardest in your mind?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that certainly my own experience of this is very heavily tilted towards arguing with various kinds of libertarians. And hardest is a little hard to say, because I think, like, look, I'll say that the libertarianish person I've argued with, just to make this personal, who seemed to be most intense, was Yarnbrook from the Ayn Rand Institute.
Oh, I did. I remember I traveled around the country doing debates with him. Was it last year or something? Yeah, it was last year. It feels like forever ago. I spent a lot of time with that guy. Very annoying on the debate stage, but was nice enough when we like got a bite to eat, before these events. But he was one of the libertarians who, like someone later in this debate, will just openly say, or objectivist, I should say, like, yeah, Jesus Christ was with the other guy. We don't like Jesus. He was mystifying. And in one particular debate with him, I kind of pandered to the crowd, which is had a lot of Christian conservatives in it, and basically just say, like, this is a social belief and an egotism that would destroy like the social fabric of community and civic life and whatever else. And I felt a little bit guilty, kind of quietly dog whistling, in a left communitarian way to like, to the fact that these were crazy people. But anyway.
Yeah, no,
I think in my mind, the hardest people to debate are sometimes, if you find a good, like, in general, like, we're used to the social democratic argument of like, the like post 59 European social democratic argument of like, we could wield capitalism to achieve these certain things. We've already achieved it. And our retort is often, well, look what happened after. Yes, there hasn't been like complete retrenchment, but the welfare state has declined. Like, you've left the levers of control in the hands of capitalists, so they were able to launch a counteroffensive against social democracy. So to be the real social democrat, to preserve social democracy, you have to go further into democratic socialism.
Right.
But I think those that come prepared with like the empirical evidence of, okay, well, we still have these social rights and guarantees. We still have X amount of the GDP going to public spending, and we still have a presence for social democratic politics, like why gamble everything on a more radical break with capitalism? And I think of Sherry Berman and Ken Laneworthy and some other people as an argument that I think more radical socialists like us can win, but it does require a slightly different toolkit. And then also, obviously, there's a lot of defenders of capitalism who really do believe in a role for the state, who are willing to concede that there's like different levels of state intervention. So they would like defend both French capitalism, which is very statist in the 20th century, but also defend American style capitalism and talk about market failure. And obviously then it's like a debate in which you don't really know what they're going to say. So you have to actually listen and respond versus like these guys. It's like, it's the same script, which I guess is also true of very orthodox Marxists too.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Although that does sound like the debate with Sherry Berman and those others, like that does sound more interesting, I've got to say, than the one I watched with you. I think Yaron was a little bit more restrained with me. He was yelling about how we're going to like expropriate his television set, because he grew up in a kibbutz and he knows how socialism works. But in any case, I think I would be interested in whether in those sorts of debate, any of those people who really defend that position, like the extent to which they just stake their claim on we don't need socialism because social democracy is more stable than we think it is, and the extent to which they would push back against the more principled ideological argument against stopping at social democracy.
I think a lot of it is political, in that they would say that socialists with, let's say, my mentality, who were trying to force the social democratic movement in the early 20th century and onward throughout the 20th century into a posture of opposition, ended up just ceding the state and government to the right with really disastrous compromises. But it was the socialists willing, in their account, like Sherry Berman's, to embrace politics and to embrace governing, who managed to, with an uneven record and deal with the contradictions of managing the bourgeois state and deliver real gains for workers. So I think she would blame, let's say, even some of the failures of Weimar Germany, with socialists still half being in a posture of opposition and not really believing that they could do much for the bourgeois state, and also the UK Labour Party in the 30s that way. And socialists in Sweden later on, and in post-war social democracy, being willing to manage the contradictions of the bourgeois state. And I think, again, that's an argument that has been dealt with in a few different places. I think there's really good review by Dylan Riley in New Left Review, Bernstein's Hairs, that it criticizes Berman's position from a slightly more orthodox quasi-Trotskyist perspective, but it's really, well written. But I think that's like first of all, it's a nice, good faith debate to have from people who like generally seem committed to improving the standing of workers. But that's something when our book comes out, I'm looking forward to figuring out the assortment of people to debate and have discussions with. Because obviously, like, the libertarians are easy because like we're both fringe. Like Reason and Jacobin did that debate in like 2019, and Vivek, I was just like a sidekick. I was like Puffy on the track, and Vivek Chipper was Biggie laying the good verses, and I was just like his sidekick. But that debate was really good. But it's easy to be in dialogue with the Reason libertarian types. It's I think harder to frame the debate with people in the center. I think they're less apt to have those big ideological debates.
Yeah. So they don't want to argue about whether exploitation is wrong in itself. Even if we can get some decent society while still keeping it. I mean, I guess I would say, I don't know if this is exactly the same question and as what's hardest, but I'll say that I definitely find myself getting the most frustrated in debates with other people who are basically radical leftists, but disagree with me about because they're tankies, or because they think that working within the Democratic Party is wrong, or whatever. And those are the ones where I find myself getting most frustrated. Although, and actually, I think credit where credit's due. When I was talking to him before he was on my show, I think Thaddeus Russell said something insightful about that. Since I sort of admitted to him, it's like, yeah, look, I don't really find myself getting very angry when I'm arguing with libertarians, but I totally get angry, when I'm arguing with other leftists. And he was like, yeah, of course you don't, because they're not in the family. You get, you get angry with other leftists because because you take it more personally, when you.
And also, like, if we're coming to it from the same moral place, I think it can be frustrating to see people kind of get part of it, but not the rest. And also, I do think that, like, within our tradition, there's a particular bit of like a particularly annoying sectarian strain. They could be almost like Talmudic of like, let us dissect. Like, people quote Marx at you to convince you that you're not a Marxist, which is like is always a frustrating thing. And I always return to that Joan Robinson retort to one of her more orthodoxly Marxist friends, which is the difference between me and you is that you have Marx in your mouth, I have Marx in my bones.
Yeah. Which shout out to our co-author Mike Beggs. Has his zombie Marx article where he quotes that old Jacobin article, but worth looking up and reading for sure.
Speaking of, I think Mike's hard at work right now on the actual book. I got down 1,000 words today, a little bit more, about 1,250 words today, so I feel okay. But I did delete like 400 words that I didn't like before, so there was like a net gain of 100 words, which is getting there slowly. So yeah, that's like a future plug for people. I think we'll have something out maybe in fall 2022 for people to read.
Yeah, for sure. And I like the fact that you expressed it that way, since since I think you're writing about the history of whatever you want actually existing, whatever you want to call it, and you sort of talked about your work as if you were a low-level Soviet planner, talking about whether you're meeting your targets or not.
Yeah, because also it's all quantitative. It's not qualitative. I didn't
Exactly.
1,300 words were any good. But I do think, like, especially going through this experience with both like this research and also for my last book or whatnot, I definitely have become more attuned to the fact that there were a lot of well-intentioned people trying to construct socialism at the level like mid and low level bureaucrats and ordinary workers too, in countries like Hungary and Yugoslavia and Russia and the Soviet Union and so on. And there's a lot to learn from the experience, which I think should be complicated for socialism. And that if you just believe that this was all a totalitarian veneer from the very beginning, and socialism was just used as lip service to pursue a narrow class agenda of a group of new elites, then I think it's easy to just say, okay, we could figure out the technical aspects of socialism pretty easily if we have a more democratic system, if we have a more earnest and democratically responsive group of leaders, and so on. Whereas I do think that there were a lot of things that should worry us about why, let's say, the system of self-management in Yugoslavia failed, or why, for instance, there were so many coordination problems with Soviet planning. So obviously, I think there's some good answers to it. I think that, if anything, learning from these experiences makes us more credible as pushing for socialism of a very different type in the 21st century. But yeah, it's been interesting to kind of read all these accounts, and now it's time to stop reading and procrastinating and actually write the thing. But go Bills. I hope everyone in the chat is rooting for the Bills, unless you're from Kansas City, in which you have an excuse. But do you have any preferences? I forgot to ask.
Not really. No, I mean, not in this. I think I'm not. Yeah, I mean, I'll watch, when we get done, but I don't have a strong rooting preference here.
Yeah. Well, we'll get together soon. I think the pandemic will be At least, hopefully, depending on how disastrous our vaccine rollout is, in a good enough place that we could watch the Super Bowl next year in a sports bar in New York or something. Like some terrible. I can't wait to be able to like drink a Bud Light that's way overpriced at a midtown sports bar in New York City.
Sounds amazing right now. Yeah, exactly. I can't even imagine that after the last year.
But anyway, thanks a lot for doing it. I wanna do another, and maybe that. Have you already did the Hitch Iraq War one with George Galloway?
We did the Galloway one, although I will say that there are there are a good number of Hitch Iraq War ones. So
we need to do one where he's cast as the villain now, because I feel like this is just like the prelude before he became Vader.
Yeah, fair enough. We could do. We could do one of the other ones for sure. I'm actually just trying to think off the top of my head what the other good like villainous Hitch debates were. Galloway is a classic, and the one he did with Peter is a classic. Although we watched that, but we'll think about that. We'll come up with something. Maybe have you back in a few weeks. I think I'll watch the 20 minutes until the Q&A with the chat to just for the sake of completeness.
Wait, and also when you're in the Q&A though, skip ahead to I'll try to find you the timestamps. There's two awesome things in the Q&A that the audience should witness. So I'll try to find you the timestamps during like a commercial break or something, and maybe you could skip ahead and do like 30-second bite-sized bits, because one of them's like the audience just totally owns one of the Ayn Rand person. This like college student has a brief, funny retort, and then also in another one, one of the objectivists criticizes Jesus Christ as a socialist and Judeo-Christian values, which I think is funny. But.
Fair enough. So okay. So we'll watch. I'll watch until the Q&A, and then those 2 30-second bits. But go. But I know this is hurting you. So go watch.
Yeah. It's not a Knicks game because the Knicks are on the West Coast, and that's what I'll be doing at 10 p.m. But it's close. So I'll catch you guys later.
All right. See you later, Bhaskar. All right.
Thank you, Mr. Hitchens. The next 4 rejoinders will be 5 minutes in length, and they will follow the same sequence of the first 4. It will be after these speeches that the audience will begin its questioning period.
I'm a little bit at a loss, since both of my opponents, or our opponents, seem to be presenting themselves as the Republicans used to the Democrats. Me too. We're for freedom too. We're for some form of laissez-faire integrated with socialism. We're for liberty. And we both share a dislike of Ronald Reagan. Well, we all 4 agree on that one point, that Ronald Reagan is a disgrace, probably for different reasons. I didn't vote for him in either election because I thought he was a phony. And I agree with Mr. Hitchens that he preaches the rhetoric of laissez-faire, or at least of half-fair capitalism. But then his actions seem to be dictated by the New York Times. So I view him as a Carter in Reagan's clothing, in effect. That's for concrete application. But there seems to be so much rushing to agree with us that I wonder, are we doing better than I thought? People used to be absolutely knocked off their chairs by someone advocating laissez-faire, and maybe we've become a little bit too successful. So let's bring this down from the clouds a little bit. We advocate the immediate abolition of the antitrust laws. We advocate the immediate removal of the welfare system as fast as possible, perhaps over 4 or 5 years, to the total elimination of all welfare. We advocate the immediate abolition of the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Depository Insurance Company, the CCC, ICC, just about any alphabet agency you can bring up. I mean, we're talking about something very different from socialism. We're talking about untrammeled, complete free trade, where people can buy and sell as they choose, as long as they do not initiate physical force against others. Now, I wanted to just respond to a few implications of ideas in the socialist side that I want to disavow. We do not hold equality as a value or virtue or ideal, if by equality you mean anything other than equal rights before the law. That term is used very ambiguously. Equal rights before the law, so that there is one system of justice in the law courts for rich and for poor, is exactly what I've been arguing for. Today, all the rights are on the side of the poor and the workers, and all the suffering is on the side of those big capitalist businessmen. They are considered guilty in any confrontation without the need for proof or evidence. They're considered guilty because they're greedy capitalists. So equality before the law, yes, but equality of income, equality of life, equality in any other sense, absolutely no. People have different abilities. People work with different degrees of intensity and effort and success, and to some extent just plain luck. And those equalities have no moral those inequalities have no moral significance whatsoever. I have never in all my years in philosophy come across any argument as to why there is any moral issue involved in one man having 1,000 times the wealth of his neighbor. I would like to know, on what basis is there something wrong with that? And on what basis is it better if the incomes or wealths are equalized? Because there is no such argument. As to the family being altruistic, I don't belong to a family. We are not Reagan conservatives. We do not stand up here and champion family. We champion the individual. I would like to find someone I can marry. I don't plan to have children. And if I have someone that I love whom I marry, it won't be someone who joins with me on the basis of from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. It will be trading value for value, both economically and in terms of spiritual values. Finally, the idea of class and collectivism, we totally disavow. There is no such thing as a class. There are just individuals. And I would claim, if I had time, that that's based on the denial of free will. Their view is based on determinism, the idea that if you're born in such and such a situation, you have to have the ideas and values of your parents. We uphold free will, that a man makes himself. Thank you.
Well, I wonder whether you found it as difficult to understand Christopher and I as I sometimes find it difficult to understand the objectivists. I think that we both have, to a certain extent, a metaphysics that we understand and that may not be comprehensible to people outside. At least I found myself at a loss at times trying to understand the meaning of such words as life and selfishness as I listened to my fellow debaters discuss capitalism. Let me try to restate, if I will, some of my argument, and while I do that, I'll refer to points that have been made. First, I see capitalism as a social system, as a historical system, not as an ideal that has not yet been realized, as a social system that evolved out of feudalism and that has a certain history, and it's a history that we can learn from. In the United States, the crucial part of that history is the one that really is at stake here. It's the history of the early republic, because in those days were born the ideals by which we still live, by which we're governed, as Christopher mentioned, hypocritically. So that the crucial question for us is, how can those laissez-faire ideals be realized? And what happened in America? What happened during the Civil War? Why was it that we fought a war based on the idea of all men are created equal? And out of that, let's say 60 years later, we had a society in which there was gross inequality. Now, are there classes? Do people have free will? I think here there's a confusion of normative and description and descriptive terms, whether we're talking about how life ought to be or how life is, whether in fact the society is organized a certain way or whether it ought to be organized a certain way. And what I'm trying to say is that out of this attempt in our Jeffersonian, Jacksonian period, the period of the Civil War, to create a society that was free and equal, a much different society got created, one in which there were not only differences in income, but differences in income that were related to differences in the relationship that people had to private property, and particularly to large-scale private property. And that's what we talk about when we talk about classes. And that helps us understand certain things about the society. Now, the state, are governments necessary? Something that again, was an issue for Tom Paine and is an issue for us today. There are certain reasons, I think, why we have to have a government today and why it does have to play a certain role in the economy. And I don't mean just antitrust laws. I mean the experience of the Great Depression, of depressions that began in the early 19th century, panics leading up through the depression of the 1890s, the depression of the 1930s, depressions which were caused by the anarchy of the capitalist system. The only solution for which was some form of government regulation, whether we like it or not. And today, I would suggest that in many, to a great extent, our own problems as an economy, our declining balance of trade, if I can use such a mundane and dirty expression, in a time when we're talking about much more high-level things, is partly related to the fact that our economy is so structured so differently than the Japanese, and that we haven't sufficiently used our government in a creative economic way to increase our own productivity, but rather under the name of laissez-faire, have only used it to protect certain forms of greed and largesse. So I hope we're not speaking entirely past each other and that we can have this a fruitful discussion of what is at stake in this issue between capitalism and socialism.
Well, I've debated socialism. This is my 10th time. These are definitely the nicest socialists I ever debated. However, I think I'll take off the gloves a little bit here. Because in fact, there is fundamental difference on the stage. And I want to make it explicit what it is. Before I do that, I would like to say that the socialists have been putting forward the values that they say socialism embraces. I don't really think they have made an argument for those values. It's one thing to state your values. It's another thing to try and show why those values serve man's life. And I really don't believe that they did that. I thought that the idea of liberty that they put forward, which meant that we were to be born free of inherited duties and obligations, is a very small component of what it really means to a man to be free. So that I really am not convinced that the socialists have got into the ethics of the case for socialism, let alone the view of man that might underlie the ethics that they would have had to have argued for. The principle to each, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, is really an endorsement of the morality of altruism. The morality that some people, to live the virtuous life, should voluntarily give up some of their wealth so that others who have less can benefit. It is the morality of self-sacrifice. And they should argue for that morality. That is the morality that socialism attempts to institutionalize in society. They have not acknowledged the role of force in a socialist culture. They have said a few things which hint on that. Professor Hitchens, for example, I guess it isn't professor, is it? Referred to civilization throughout history was a matter of cooperation, and he said, as an aside, coerced or otherwise. It's a big difference. He also quoted Marx, where he said that Marx had said that private interest was all right, but it must be made to mesh with the general interest. Now, what does this mean? This means that the socialists, in fact, are advocates of what we can properly call a statist society, a society where the state has a big function to play. In essence, where the state is going to take over by expropriation the private property of the producers of a country and run that private property according to what they think is in the best interests of everyone. Socialism rests on an enormous act of expropriation of property, which is a violent act. And so consequently, the socialists have really not addressed the questions to the role of the state in their ideal society. It is no accident that every society in history, whether there has been yet achieved a perfect socialist society or not, every attempt has ended up, of course, with a very, very large role for the state to play, which is a denial of the rights of man and of man's need for freedom in a social context, and is exactly the opposite of what we are talking about. It turns out, as Mr. Judas said, that we notice, he claims that the anarchy of capitalism caused depressions, which set up a stage for the need for government. Well, in fact, there is a very good debate, which I think is conclusive that, in fact, it was not the market that caused depressions. It was interference with the market that caused depressions. And it was early statism, which then turned and used the depression as an excuse for more statism. But the fact of the matter is, they are advocates of statism. They, in essence, say, you know, it turns out that if we leave people free, there are unfortunately problems which develop. And so consequently, we have to bring the state to bear in order to create the beautiful world. So the essence of what the socialists are talking about, in my judgment, is give me the power of government. Give me the gun, because I want to build a beautiful world according to my blueprint. And I have plans through which I will coerce everybody who would not voluntarily cooperate with these plans into living in the beautiful future which they apparently do not understand. Now, we're opposed to that. We are standing up for freedom in a serious way. We are standing up for the principles this country was founded on. We are standing up for the principle of man's inalienable rights, and we are taking them seriously and not willing to compromise them at all. Now, I want to conclude by saying that Mr. Judas started, and he said that he referred to laissez-faire capitalism as a fleeting ideal. It is not a fleeting ideal. Despite their claims that capitalism has already existed, it has not, for the reasons I presented. But it can exist. Ideas determine human history, and that's what this debate is about ideas for the future of this culture. And hopefully, if the ideas we're putting forward eventually hold sway in this culture, we will be fortunate enough to see a true laissez-faire ideal. It will be not a fleeting ideal by any means at all. Thank you.
All right, I was going to play it out until the end of the main part of the debate. We're not going to watch the Q&A, but I was going to play it out till the end of the main part of the debate before interjecting again and summing up. But that does need a little bit of, that cries out for a little bit of debunking. So let's just go through everything that this guy just said, right? So the claim about statism and depressions, the claim about the role of the state and past attempts at socialism, and the claim about ethics and the view of man that any given ethical system is based on. So it's saying that in every attempt at socialism that's existed so far, there's this big role for a big repressive state. Seems like a pretty obvious double standard, because why not say that in every attempt at capitalism that's ever existed, there's been a role for a big repressive state. Because if you're going to talk about actually existing capitalism, then you'd have to talk about the ways that the ways that the gun was used to impose capitalism, both in the imperial heartland with the enclosures to drive peasants off of land and deprive them of access to what had previously been the commons, so that they'd have to accept jobs at factories, or the global version with colonialism, which isn't necessarily what I know that it's a little bit more complicated if you look at what some smart left historians say about that than just capitalism, was fueled by colonialism. Early versions of colonialism, like in the Spanish Empire, that were still tied to feudalism, didn't have the same results. But certainly the way that capitalism was imposed on much of the world was through colonial violence. The track record of actually existing capitalism also includes, fascism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this, if you are going to say, you actually existing socialism meant this, meant having a big repressive state, then you'd have to also acknowledge that actually existing capitalism has been based on the activities of a big repressive state that's also done things like charter corporations, protect intellectual property, mint currency, all these things that capitalism, relies on for its dynamism. If, on the other hand, you're going to say, no, but that's not real capitalism because it wasn't a libertarian utopia, then at the very least, people like me and Bhaskar should be able to say that the Soviet Union wasn't real socialism because it didn't involve democratic workers' control of the means of production. So it's, either we can just ignore what's actually existed historically and talk about ideal types, in which case his case against socialism doesn't get off the ground, or we have to talk about what's actually existed in history, in which case the contrast between capitalism and socialism that he's drawing doesn't get off the ground. And that's also the reason why his claim about depressions is just kind of empty, because, of course, all actually existing economies have involved massive doses of state intervention at all sorts of levels. And so you can speculate about how, if we hadn't had forms of state intervention X, Y, and Z, we would have gotten these great results. Yeah, it's unknowable. But we do know that we do know what has been effective in terms of countering depressions in the past as far as state intervention. If you want to argue, we wouldn't need that in the first place if we had real pure capitalism and there's no state intervention. Which, by the way, if you're going to talk about the history of actually existing American capitalism, then again, you want to talk about state intervention. We're talking about an economic system built up in large part. Again, I don't want to exaggerate or flatten the historical complications, but certainly in its early stages was very tied up with the slave trade. And extremely coercive, and was very and played out on land stolen from genocide victims, and of course the trains which Ayn Rand chooses that as the setting for for John Galt's work as the train system. But of course you couldn't have a train system without massive doses of state intervention. Think about what the routes would be like without something like eminent domain to guarantee that you could actually go from point A to point B without some incredibly crazy zigzag. So again, actually existing capitalism always involves state repression. You can speculate about about how you think we wouldn't have some of the problems that existed under actually existing capitalism if we had, real pure Randian capitalism. But then again, you can play that game in the other direction and say that we wouldn't have, wouldn't have had the problems of the actually existing Soviet system if it had been, pure communism. What's the difference? Finally, on the ethical point, this idea that socialism, is based on, has to be, that the normative case for socialism has to be based on an ethical system that's entirely about self-sacrifice, is wrong for all the reasons that Bhaskar and I talked about earlier. I don't think I need to rehash all of that. But as far as that business about, the view of man, which I think even in 1986 was already kind of a clunky and anachronistic sounding phrase, but let's say the view of what counts as a good in a human life that socialism is based on, it could just be the same view that objectivism is based on, only applied more consistently. This is the point that I was hammering away on in my debate with Yaron Brook from the Ayn Rand Institute. That if you're going to make a big deal about how about human creativity and human flourishing, when you're exalting selfishness, the pursuit of self-interest, then you need to explain why other people don't count just as much, why other people who might be born into poverty, not be able to go to private schools, etc., don't count just as much. And if you have the basic view they do about what counts as a good human life, being able to use your reason and live up to your full potential and all of that stuff, but you also, on a fundamental level, care about other people. It's like that classic South Park bit where it's the toilet paper episode where Stan and Kyle and Eric Cartman toilet papered the art teacher's house. Some other kid was blamed for it, but Stan and Kyle want to confess now, and Cartman says, "But why would you do that? We got away with it. We're not going to get punished." And they said, "No, but Eric, we feel bad." And he says, "But I don't understand. You're not going to get punished." And they try to explain, "Eric, we feel bad for other people. So if you combine their view, the objectivist view of what's important in a human life, people's ability to flourish, to use their reason, to live up to their full potential, but you also have the basic insight that Stan and Kyle, but not Cartman, have, that other people also matter," then that gives you an excellent reason to be a socialist. It certainly at least gives you an excellent reason to be a social democrat. So you believe that people can have the things necessary to live up to that full potential, like healthcare, like education, so they can pursue the career of their choice, and it even gives you a reason to go beyond social democracy to be a socialist. So people can apply that creativity and run their own lives at the workplace. So the idea, the idea that you have to have some view of human nature that's very different from what they're talking about in order to make sense of socialism is wrong. You just have to not be a sociopath. You have to give a shit about other people. And the view that socialism is all about the initiation of aggression is also totally wrong for, again, the Matt Brunig reason that when you talk about initiation of aggression, you've snuck in something that has nothing to do with force or aggression. The extra consideration that you snuck in is who has a right to some given piece of property, because what Randians and libertarians will count as initiating aggression is using force to take something that you don't have a right to. That's what they really mean. That's why recovering stolen property isn't aggression in their view. That's why violently resisting the tax collector wouldn't even necessarily be aggression in their view. So the question is, who has a right to what? And of course, we all agree that we have a right to our own bodies. That's why the G.A. Cohen thought experiment, the eyeball lottery, would be unjust. The disagreement is about who has a right to what external property. And as far as that goes, yeah, you can have the libertarian view that the external property that you have a right to is just whatever you end up with from the chips falling where they may in a series of market interactions that happen on a wildly unfair, playing field created by various historical circumstances. But that's not a very morally plausible theory. A more plausible theory of who has a right to what has to do with considerations like distributive fairness, considerations like people's ability in practice to have autonomous lives and not be too dependent on unjust domination by others, on considerations like what's the distribution that's going to give everybody the best chance to live up to their individual potential, consistent with everybody else having those chances. Those are the things that I think go into a vastly more plausible moral theory, again, based on the same basic view that they have and that Marx had about what was valuable in human lives. But in any case, let's watch Hitchens' final statement, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you, Mr. Ridpath. The last speaker at this stage of the debate will be Mr. Hitchens. Following Mr. Hitchens' presentation, the audience questioning will commence. Mr. Hitchens?
I regret that what I say will be a little more fragmentary than my opening presentation, because there are a number of challenges that have been offered to our side, which I mustn't let pass, but can only deal with one at a time. First, I specifically did not state that the principle of from each, etc., as I think we can agree to call it, as embodied in the bourgeois family, was a principle of altruism. It was simply a principle of necessity. There is no other way that that a family could be run, and that therefore this principle prefigures the extension of such a principle to society itself, and we can see it, as it were, in the womb of the old, as Engels would have said and was in fact over fond of saying. Now, there's a very great and unrecognized, I think, in their own minds, confusion in our two opponents here about capitalism, liberty, and private property and the relationship between them. The history of capitalism, and even more so, this should be said of the history of capitalism in its imperialist phase, its heroic period, is the history of expropriation. It is the history of the robbery of private property from millions and millions of people. Marx, observing this process in the Communist Manifesto, remarks on the tremendous advances in productivity and technique and innovation that were thereby enabled, but he does point to the fact that many, many people who hitherto had owned land, property, and so on were expropriated, collectivized, and made into the modern proletariat. He thought the price was worth paying. He thought capitalism was an advance over what had gone before. But let nobody tell you that capitalism cannot coexist with the expropriation of private property. It can and does. This, I think, would assist us to answer an even more intriguing question, which is why it is that capitalism has only ever evolved successfully in a very few countries. I think this is very probably because, I have to be condensed here, because its evolution ab initio was based on the robbery of other countries' wealth and productivity. Let me again remind you of what Marx said about India. A tremendous expropriation by British imperialism of the resources of capital accumulation from India. An enormous input to the British Industrial Revolution, still the heartland of the evolution of capitalism, but a fantastic desolation of private property in India. Again, Marx thought it was probably, in the long run, justifiable, because India would in the end succeed in coming together as a state and overcoming the feudal ties imposed by the Mughal emperors that had been sundered by the imperialist invasion. But don't let anybody suggest to you for an instant that capitalism does not regard people as means. Probably more than any other system in history, it has made a virtue of that ability, of the ability to conscript, to expropriate, and to dispossess in order to become an engine of wealth. And that is why, finally, the responsibility for the overweening power of certain states is that, historically speaking, of capitalism. Because in the countries where capitalism either did not, or because of imperialism, could not take root, capital accumulation had to be done another way. You can't not have capital, after all, though you can not have capitalism. And capital can be accumulated one way or it can be accumulated the other. And in the oriental despotisms of the East and the modern versions of those, capitalism had to be substituted for by the state. But that is because of the failure of capitalism. It's intimately related to it, let me say. I can't blame them for everything. Thus, it's perfectly simplistic to say that capitalism represents freedom from state power, because both in the countries of its success and in the countries of its failure, the relationship with the modern state, the giant state, the state that can regard the citizen as its property for large numbers of practical purposes, is very close indeed. And I think this, what I have said, should be enough in itself to rebut the ridiculous accusation that only socialists are interested in violence. I could stand, or need it for the vindication of their program. I really could stand here all night and read the list of names of people who've been murdered by capitalist regimes when the interest of illicit private property and governments based on it is felt to be threatened. There is no length to which capital will not go in those contingencies. Fascism was capitalism. The structure of the capitalist state in Germany survived and coexisted, and in Italy and in Spain, survived and coexisted with the fascist period throughout. I don't mean to say that capitalism is fascism, but capitalism can coexist with any system, and its attitude to liberty is as instrumental and contingent as its attitude to equality. I see I have no more time, but I'm prepared to defend anything I've said at greater length in the subsequent period. Thank you.
All right. I saw somebody in chat saying that this seemed really different from later Hitch. They might remember from the post 2001 stuff that you normally see all over YouTube. And I know what they mean because, of course, that later Hitch isn't arguing for socialism. He's arguing for for atheism a lot. Probably the majority of the time against theism. He's arguing sometimes for some very bad foreign policy positions, which he took at the end of his life. My view is not that he did that because he was a sellout or a hypocrite, or he didn't really believe it or anything like that. I think he had partially good motives, and he sincerely believed that this was spreading some sort of at least basic bourgeois democratic revolution, because he'd given up on hope for ordinary people in those societies doing it for themselves when he gave up on socialism. That would be my hot take on Hitch's development. I think there's probably also, that's not to say that that's the entire analysis. I think there's also some pretty crass Islamophobia in the mix. I think it's multi-causal, what happened to him at the end, that there's a lot going on there. So I understand what people are saying, when they say this seems very different from later Hitch in terms of content. But of course, it's also remarkable how all of the rhetorical style is pretty much entirely there at this point. This is, I think that's exactly right. That he kind of fell for the end of history stuff to some extent, even though he was never a Stalinist. He always advocated a more democratic form of socialism. I think it really seemed at a certain point in the 90s and 2000s, like global socialist movement, it was never really coming back. That it was just done. That in a certain sense history had ended. So I don't think he ever gave up on the idea that socialism would have been more desirable than capitalism. But I do think he gave up on the idea that it was ever going to happen, that it was meaningfully possible in practice, which is a lot, which is the position that a lot of people, I think a lot of people at the time went through similar trajectories. But again, the rhetorical style is there. That little moment at the end where he says that, capitalism at times has meant fascism, and all of the, the chuds in the audience start to boo at that entirely accurate historical statement. And the way he kind of leans into the audience, reacting against him, and does that, and in Italy and in Spain, that's a very, that's the kind of rhetorical move that Hitch uses a lot in the later debates. That was a very recognizable bit of late Hitchens, and I think a lot of the other rhetorical flourishes are very similar in this kind of young socialist Hitchens that we're seeing in this debate. Even though obviously his politics are better at this stage of his career. All right, guys, I think we're going to wrap there for tonight, and they'll let anybody else wants to go watch football do that. I think that's right. I think that was his point pretty explicitly. The hypocrisy of accusing leftists of loving state violence when capitalism literally depends on it. I think that is exactly what he was saying. But anyway, I think we're going to wrap there for tonight. Again, just want to plug a few things coming up, like I did at the top. So tomorrow night, for the next regular episode, episode 26, is going to feature a panel on Biden and American Empire with Daniel Bessner, Katie Halper, and Rania Kalik. And then on Wednesday, also with Bessner, as well as with, of course, our producer and movie correspondent Forrest, and also Jacobin Deputy Editor Micah Utrecht, and I believe also philosophy professor Ryan Lake. On Wednesday, we're going to be doing a movie live stream talking about Dr. Strangelove. And then on Thursday for patrons, the next, patron exclusive Thursday episode drops. So that's episode 27, which is, this is again a very Bessner heavy, a couple weeks on GTAA. But that's the Thursday episode for patrons is going to be an interview with Bessner again, as well as with Amber Lee Frost on their excellent Jacobin piece about QAnon and sort of dissecting the lunacy and cultishness of QAnon, but also the ways that it arises from this kind of widespread misery in the neoliberal hellscape that we're living in. There's there's some really striking details in there. Like one of the widespread Q conspiracy theories is that Donald Trump was going to forgive everybody's medical debt, which is both kind of funny, given everything we know about Donald Trump, and also incredibly sad, because without, obviously this is a lunatic, far right movement, with whom I don't think there's any convincing most of the people who've already fallen into this rabbit hole. But also that says something about the seed, the soil in which shit like this grows, that we live in such a hellscape that the only way people could imagine, some sort of universal medical debt cancellation is through some sort of messiah figure just delivering it on high as part of a secret plan, rather than through political action from below. That just seems, anyway. The Bessner and Amber Frost episode is coming up on Thursday for patrons. The Patreon episode from last week was the new installment in the monthly series of Sopranos recap bonus episodes with Mike Racine, Nando Villa, and Wosny Lambre. The week before was Dasha from Red Scare. The week before that was Jean Bajalan giving a beginner's guide to the Kurdish liberation struggle. So I think those have all been very solid. You get all that stuff for $5 a month. Which I certainly understand. People who aren't in a position to swing that right now. I've been there. $5 at the end of the month could make a big difference. But if you are in a position to swing it, obviously you get all that stuff as well as the Discord server and regularly scheduled Discord office hours and other patron features that are in development as a gesture of gratitude. But the basic thing is it's a good thing to do out of that sense of solidarity that Hitch was talking about earlier, to support the work that we do here and to pay everybody who helps make the show and the channel work. So please do consider doing that if you are in a position to do so. Even if you're not in a position to do so, please do like and subscribe here on YouTube and rate and review wherever you get podcasts. These things really do make a difference. Otherwise, I will see everybody tomorrow night for episode 26, Biden and U.S. Empire, with Katie Halper, Rania Kalik, and Daniel Bester. Looking forward to that. See everybody then. Left is best.